direction on the council whether they wish to pursue the opportunity that is before us. So with that being said, Nelson Miller.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mayor and City Council. To start off tonight, I would like to mention that we do have a couple of our planning commissioners here. We did invite the planning commission to make this a joint session. However, 3 of the commissioners are out of town, so we don't have a quorum of the planning commission. But we do have 2 of the planning commissioners here to listen tonight. I also wanted to mention that we have a couple of our partner agencies here that listen to the presentation. The Riverside Transit Agency is represented by Larry Rubio, the CEO, Tom Franklin, the COO, and Kristen Warsinski, the Director of Planning. Also, from the County EDA Housing Authority, we have Mervyn Manola. So these are these are partner agencies that the city has been working with on these projects, and I think it's important for the council to see that they're a committed part of this. In fact, honestly, they've been waiting for the city to move forward. So that's part of what we're trying to look at tonight. This relates actually, though, to Senate Bill 2, and we're using that as a vehicle to facilitate some of these other projects. The purpose of Senate Bill 2 was to provide funding and technical assistance to all local governments in California to help cities and counties prepare, adopt, and implement plans and process improvements that streamline housing approvals and accelerate housing production. It's funded through a $75 fee on all documents that are recorded with the county recorder's office. So in the first year, 50% of the funds generated from that are dedicated to these planning grants. And then in subsequent years, there will be monies available for actual implementation. We won't be limited to planning. However, in the first year, we are limited to planning activities. So, in the planning grants, it's important to note that these are non-competitive grants. Based upon the population, there's $310,000 allocated to the city of Hemet. We don't have to compete for that. We simply have to apply for it. However, there are 6 project priority areas that the State Department of Housing and Community Development is really looking for cities to comply with. And those 6 areas are identified here. Rezone to permit housing by right. That means non-discretionary approvals. So projects would come into the city and go through a staff plan review, plan check process without approval or review by the Planning Commission or the City Council. Those would use objective development standards. And that's a critical part of what we're going to talk about as we move forward through this proposed applications. The second area is develop those objective design standards or pre-approved site and architectural plans that facilitate non-discretionary permitting. Now that's a big thing for developers because the discretionary process can often take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. So it really facilitates the timing of that and the uncertainty. And then there's other areas: prepare specific plans with environmental analysis, establish mechanisms to encourage accessory dwelling units like second dwelling units, expedite permit processing through streamlining, and create plans and programs to finance and increase infrastructure with accompanying enhanced housing capability. And we're also using that as one of our project areas. So, to look at this $310,000, staff has developed 5 proposed projects. And, you know, I recognize these may be controversial, which is why we wanted to have this work study session tonight. The first project would be to develop objective design and development standards for by right permitting, which means non-discretionary review. It would simply go to staff for review. But we would create a set of objective design standards and development standards that would say, you have to comply with all of these, and staff plan checks all of that. It's my belief that we can do that and accomplish everything that we accomplish through discretionary review. In fact, maybe even be a little more precise about it. The second project is electronic plan review. which expedites permitting processing. That would allow developers to submit their plans totally electronically, for them to be reviewed and plan checked within that system, and the comments returned back to the developers. Right now, we're sort of doing that, but it's rather cumbersome and takes some additional time and processing. So this would facilitate that, and included in this key component is training. The city has attempted a process like this several years ago, and it never really went forward because the outside developers didn't really understand it, and in-house staff didn't really utilize it. So a major component of this will be training, not only for in-house staff, but also training the development community on how they can facilitate this. Now, this is being much more widely used now, and so a number of jurisdictions already use this. So I think it'll be much easier than it was a few years ago. The other project is rezoning of the North Hemet area that was a subject of the North Hemet specific plan about 10 years ago. That fell by the wayside with the recession. County EDA Housing Authority owns about 28 acres north and south of Menlo on the west side of State Street, and it would be going back and looking at those properties to rezone them. And there's more details on each of this. This is just an overview. And then the downtown TOD housing, which is the mobility hub project. Again, we look at rezoning that to allow that to move forward with non-discretionary reviews, to use the objective design and development standards, and looking at finance plans and programs to facilitate that project. And all of these would have extensive public hearings attached to them that are built into these cost estimates. The final project is general plan updates, and that does not fall within one of the project priority areas. So we must demonstrate a nexus to HCD for that. And that would be, well, we'll go into that more as we discuss the projects. So the first project that I've talked about is designing objective design and development standards. We'd see that applying to two project areas, the downtown mobility hub and the North Hemet area that the county EDA owns the property. We would use the specific plan design guidelines from the downtown Hemet specific plan as a starting point for those development standards. And again, it would facilitate by right approvals. And again, we would have a lot of public hearings and review for that before we brought it to council for final approval. So just to go quickly through these are the categories that are identified in the downtown specific plan design guidelines. Now, design guidelines are usually shoulds. What we would be doing is converting those shoulds to shalls and providing quantifiable, measurable standards. So we could look at it and say, yep, it's got to be 40 feet of continuous surface before there's some sort of architectural relief or break. And, it's quantified. So these are the kinds of things. Here we've got orient buildings to promote privacy, offset windows, balconies, or similar openings so as to not have direct line of sight into adjacent units. Design units so they do not look directly onto private patios or backyards of adjoining residential property. These are right out of the downtown design guidelines. We could probably use those without a lot of change. The next area is pedestrian connectivity, and again, these are paraphrased out of the design guidelines. We could incorporate these largely into the development standards, but we would increase some of the objectivity of these to better spell out exactly what we're looking for in those areas. So again, it's just a plan check correction, just like you review building plans for structural issues. We'd review them here. Open space. So again, here's two of the excerpts from the design guidelines. The second one, provide amenities appropriate to the project size. For example, pools, spas, play areas, and recreation buildings for larger projects. What we would be doing would be identifying specific criteria for that. So say for a project of 200 or more units, they would have to provide 2 of the major amenities, and we'd spell out what those major amenities were. And then if there were 300 units, they'd have to provide 3 of the major amenities and 2 of the minor amenities, and we'd spell out exactly what those were. So there's still some flexibility for the developer, but there's specific criteria that they must comply with. So it's taking the design guidelines to another level. And then these are the other categories that are in the design guidelines: scale and mass. You can see, the pedestrian scale that's achieved here by single-story roof lines, window treatments. We'd spell out objective criteria so that those were measurable and quantifiable. And these are excerpts, these are graphics right out of the downtown specific plan. So these are the same graphics that we're currently utilizing in the downtown specific plan with design guidelines. What we would do is turn those into development standards that could be measured. So there's building modulation, so you don't see a continuous, unbroken, flat wall surface. And we'd spell out the criteria for that. Architectural style, again, you see there's 4 different architectural styles here, so it's not mandating a single architectural style, but it is setting criteria for the types of things that have to go into that so that we see a complete style expressed, not just a flat, functional building. We are very interested in quality design. Front entries, again, spelling out how front entries would be treated, both project entries and individual unit entries. Those are all things that we can spell out. These are things, I've done this in the past where we have very objective criteria so that I could take a planner fresh out of school and say, here, review this project, and he could go right down the checklist and check off, yes, they comply, no, they don't comply, just like you would in reviewing the structural plans for a building. Roofs, again, we want modulation in the roofs, we want breakups in the roof, we want that single-story element to give it a pedestrian scale. Those are all kinds of things that we talk about in the design guidelines, but they're guidelines. We'd turn those into objective criteria. Materials and finishes, again, talking about different materials and finishes, use of not just a single thing, so you don't have a building that's all stucco. You've got some different materials into it, and you wrap the treatments around the corner so you don't have the Hollywood false front appearance. These are the kinds of things that we can incorporate in the standards. Fences and walls. We know how important security is to many people in the community, and so we'd spell out exactly the kinds of fences and walls that would be required around project perimeters and within the project, and then we'd have very specific criteria for that. Parking. One of the things we've talked about with RTA is the potential for maybe decreasing parking criteria. The RTA has talked about the new bus passes they'll be able to have where it's electronic, and it would be better facilitate if a developer wanted to come in and say, all right, we'll buy every occupant of the project a monthly bus pass. In exchange for that, we could reduce the parking requirements because people could be out using the buses. I've seen some very successful projects with that done up in the San Jose and San Francisco area, which admittedly has a little more developed transit system, but I think there's a possibility for making it work here. Again, it depends upon if we have a developer that's interested in that. Plus the walkability to downtown. The downtown transit-oriented development district is only 2.5 blocks off of downtown. So it's very walkable. And, you look at the number of restaurants and eateries that we have along Harvard, for example, just north of Florida, we'd be able to bring new businesses into that, and it'd be very walkable. Of course, site landscaping is always a concern, and yet, looking at water usage is also a criteria. So we work in standards relating to that. And exterior lighting, making sure that we have suitable lighting for parking areas and walkway areas and perimeter areas that's different kinds of lighting. And then treatment of utilities, equipment, and refuse facilities. We already have a standard design for trash enclosures, so we'd also be looking at utility and equipment enclosures. So that's really the crux of what we'd be talking about with objective design and development standards, but the key is to make them measurable, and so that we can just check them off. The second project area is that I'm emphasizing tonight is the North Hammond change of zone. On the left-hand side of this graphic, you see the properties that are owned by County EDA Housing Authority. And I should point out that 2 pink properties are also now owned by the Housing Authority. The one in the upper quadrant, which faces onto State Street, is the County Workforce Housing Supportive Center. And so that's a very important component of the type of development we might see around there. So there would be direct supportive services at the county facility that could tie directly into a county housing authority project adjacent to it. That's north of Menlo. Menlo is the street that bisects those two. South of Menlo, we'd see as more traditional apartment project. One concern that we're going to have to work through there, that area south of Menlo is in the Lake Hemet Water District, and they currently have a moratorium on new residential development. So that's an issue that we're going to have to work through with the county housing authority. I should mention on that this is consistent with the existing general plan designation, which calls for mixed use in this area. It identifies a percentage of multifamily housing as well as a percentage of office and commercial uses. And so yes, some of this property fronts on State Street, but within the area, and this is part of the extended downtown area in the specific plan, it clearly identifies a percentage to be devoted for housing, and some of that could be, mixed use, and some of it could be more traditional, just pure housing and pure commercial. And so that's what we're looking at here, where we would rezone the county ownerships plus a couple of the out parcels to R3 to facilitate development, and then we would apply those objective design and development standards to that area so that the developer would come in and know exactly what they have to comply with and not go through a discretionary approval. Now that's a key point, and that's something, if council has a concern about that, we need to hear that. And then the downtown TOD housing, the mobility hub project, of course, is one that we've talked about several times. That's 14 acres of city-owned properties that we would, again, see multifamily housing on. So now the funds that we're dedicating to the downtown housing project really relate to a whole bunch of different things to facilitate that project. So a phase 1 environmental analysis, which identifies any hazardous materials on the site, a water supply assessment, a traffic impact analysis, an updated market analysis, financial and legal options, including mechanisms to use the federal opportunity zone regulations for the benefit of this project. So really, the studies here all relate to facilitating a specific project. We take those objective design standards and apply them here. The property's already zoned appropriately for this. The downtown specific plan envisioned 390 housing units on this property. So what we're looking at is very consistent with both the general plan and the downtown specific plan, as well as the mobility hub project. This is an excerpt from the mobility hub study, and it talks about the different types of residential development, and you can see where there was a weak demand for 3-story walk-up market rate rentals, a strong demand for workforce senior housing, 3-story walk-up, and then a very weak demand for detached or 2 to 3 story small lot development. So again, what we're looking at is very consistent with the mobility hub analysis. The other part of the analysis in the mobility hub projected a demand of 68,000 square feet of retail space in the downtown area. However, this is a couple of years ago. There's currently 25,000 square feet of vacant retail office space right along Florida Avenue. Plus, what we talked about at your last meeting, there's another 15,000 square feet of city-owned properties that we hope to make available in the next couple of years. So there's a total of 40,000 square feet of office and commercial property that's basically all fronting right on Florida Avenue. You know, unfortunately for this property, in that demand, Devonshire just doesn't have the same type of exposure for commercial development. So while the mobility hub will certainly bring people into that area, we just don't feel that that's going to generate the kind of demand to really support that retail development. Now, you know, that's staff's opinion, but what we've included in this is, you know, an updated market analysis to verify that, to demonstrate that that is what's reasonable. Now, you know, we've talked about RTA, that there's some other aspects of that. Their board approved a project that included the retail. So if we're going to change that, we're going to have to go back to the RTA board and talk to them about that and talk about how we're going to support the operations and maintenance of the bus transit project. So there's still issues to work out, and that's why we've put so much money into this project area so that we can work through all of those issues. As part of the Mobility Hub project, there was a downtown connectivity analysis that talked about some of the other optional improvements that we could do to better connect the project to the downtown and ultimately to the schools to the east of the project. You know, one of the things that we often talk about is housing for teachers and housing for other workers within the community. You know, the hospital is just a little bit east of this, and what we would look at is providing some pedestrian and bicycle connections to the schools and to the hospital to facilitate workers in those locations being able to find housing here in the Mobility Hub project. So this is the bus part of the mobility project area. Council previously reviewed this a couple of years ago. There were several different options analyzed. This is the one that occurs in the southwest corner of the project where access comes off of Devonshire, right at the bottom of the screen. And this is the layout of the Mobility Hub. As you can see in this concept, there were several retail office buildings also located along Devonshire. So that would be a change that we're going to have to work through with our RTA partners to make sure that we still accomplish the same goals of this project. But that's a very important part of the collaborative relationship that the city is working with. So one of the other projects we talked about was electronic plan review. This would be purchasing the software, some hardware, and especially training, not only for city staff, but also for the development community of how to use this to better facilitate processing of their projects. Those areas all fall within the project priority areas. As long as HCD doesn't challenge that concept, then those 4 projects should be automatically approved by HCD. And right now, I've heard from some of the people that have submitted their applications recently, HCD is turning those around in 2 or 3 weeks. Now, they said if you submit by the deadline of November 30th, you can expect a 2 to 3 month turnaround. So we want to bring this forward very quickly so we can get approvals and move forward. The one catch, you know, there's always a catch when you're talking about grants. The one catch is it's all on a reimbursable basis. So the city has to expend the money and then we get reimbursed for it. So the last project is general plan updates. We are in the cycle 6 of the housing element. We currently are having a lot of discussions about the regional housing needs allocation, which the city is, and every other city in the Skag region is saying, that's impossible. But we're working through that. However, the updated housing elements are due to the State Department of Housing and Community Development by October 15, 2021. The other thing that occurred several years ago is the state, in their infinite wisdom, said, instead of using levels of service to measure traffic impact analysis, we want you to use vehicle miles traveled. So that is a change that is required to be done in the circulation element by July 1st, 2020. That's just around the corner. So we'll have to make some changes in that. Of course, Hemet, given its location basically at the end of the transportation network, we're going to see vehicle miles traveled having a much different impact upon measuring traffic analysis than levels of service. So that will have some interesting implications for the city. And we will have to make a nexus finding for that we will need to get HCD to accept in order to approve this project. So that's an overview of the projects that the staff has proposed. You know, this is a non-discretionary grant, and it's a use it or lose it. And it's this year. So if the city wants to pursue this grant, we can go after these areas. Some cities are choosing not to because they don't like these ideas. You know, that's an option that's available to council. However, I think that these are things that we can still ensure the quality of development that the city is looking for, the type of development that the city is looking for. It's just that we do it via a different mechanism of having those objective design standards. So back to the final screen, these are the 5 proposed projects that we are bringing forward to you. Thank you, Chris.
So thank you, Nelson. Mayor, if I may. Just wanted to add a couple notes. Appreciate our partners being here from RTA as well as the county, and thank Nelson for preparing this presentation. I know that the council has emphatically supported the concept of going after grants, so of course this is an opportunity that we do have before the council. As Nelson did state, some cities are choosing not to go after this funding opportunity. Another point that has been brought up, I know we've talked about it at the dais at the council meetings, but WRCOG has obviously been discussing RENA and what that means for us. And so obviously with the state taking the approach that they have in terms of punitive ways and ensuring that cities adhere to housing numbers, it really puts cities in a very different position than, let's say, 10 years ago or so. And so that is one thing that is a cause of concern for cities. I know it's a cause of concern for me as well as for Nelson too, in terms of how do we get to what the state is obviously saying should be. So with that being said, just wanted to make sure that those points were added to the conversation as well.
Any comments from council? Okay. Thank you very much, Nelson, for that presentation. And I do have quite a few questions, actually. On objective number 1 and the standards for by right permitting, would that pertain to the entire city or just the downtown area?
So what we're proposing, we would just apply these standards to 2 project areas, the Mobility Hub project and the county-owned properties.
Okay.
However, as Chris has said, you know, the state has already passed one piece of legislation that says that developers may pursue by right development if the city doesn't have a compliant housing element.
Right.
At this point in time, we do. However, the state has talked about in the next cycle, rather than measuring compliance by whether you have sufficient land zoned, they're going to look at compliance in terms of actual units produced, which is why we're placing a lot of emphasis on facilitating these 2 projects, which between the 2 of them would generate about 700 dwelling units. So, you know, if we're able to show the city, the state, that we're making every effort to comply with the things that they're talking about, we hope that that'll go a long way in terms of them deeming us compliant. I should mention, we've built less than 600 dwelling units in the last 8-year cycle in total.
Okay, so that's, and I don't have a problem with those designs in those 2 areas. As far as the electronic plan review, I think it's absolutely excellent. The North Hemet change of zone, would there be any mixed use in that area? Because right now it is mixed use, correct? And with commercial along State Street?
Yes, as you can see by the map on the right, currently both sides of State Street, all up and down there, all that vacant property is zoned commercial.
Right.
Well, the general plan calls for mixed use, a mixture of residential and commercial. So what we're proposing is the county housing authority ownership we would look at as pure residential. But then the other side of the street and pockets within this property, within this proposal area, would still remain commercial. So we would have more traditional mixed use of, all residential, all commercial, not the first floor commercial, this, upper floors residential. So not that type of mixed use, the vertical mixed use, we'd have horizontal mixed use. But that would still be consistent with the general plan.
Right. And this may be a question for the county on that. In the residential, I'm assuming it would all be multifamily or
Yes.
Or is it, can we have input on whether or not it's senior housing, or would it be open housing? I mean, for families and...
Well, that's one of the things that we could look at as part of those standards, whether or not, we can either facilitate or encourage seniors or actually require it in certain areas. However, again, given the legislature, they're enacting a number of laws that are increasingly limiting the options that cities have.
Right.
In terms of, for example, I think the city attorney just circulated something to the council that property owners can no longer use the income sources for determining whether they rent or not.
Right.
So limiting it to seniors, is another thing that may be questionable in the future. But certainly we can do things through the standards. Senior housing typically has lower parking standards.
Right.
You typically have smaller units. You have different types of recreational facilities and amenities. So we can structure the type of housing we want by the type of standards that we create.
Okay. Then into the transit-oriented, where the mobility hub would go, are you saying that to change the mobility hub would still be there,
Yes.
but that the zoning designation on the three building area there would have to change? And where are you
No.
looking at housing would be in that particular area?
Well, we would foresee, again, the change with the retail commercial, it's all consistent with the downtown specific plan.
Right.
It designated that area for transit-oriented development. It said it may include these different things. It projected 390 units for that area, which is very consistent with the densities that we're looking at.
Right.
The concept in the mobility hub of having that retail office component down there was incorporated by the RTA board into their concepts and through the mobility hub. But
Right.
we could change that project without having to change either the downtown specific plan or the general plan.
But I guess my question
But we would
Why
need to
would
go
we?
back to the board.
why would we want to change it?
Well, the reason why we would want to change it is if there's no demand for that commercial and office.
Well-
It doesn't make any sense to build it. It's a question of build it and they will come. I'm a skeptic.
Well, we can have additional discussion on that, because I have some other plans. Just so long as it's still consistent with everything that the community agreed to when we were going through the mobility hub phase, and also the downtown specific plan, because there was a lot of community input on both of those.
Yes, there was.
So, okay. And as far as the general plan update, will HCD reimburse us for that $85,000? SCAD says they'll pay for SCAD or for updates.
There's a handful of cities that have currently got their SB2 grants approved.
Okay.
It's our understanding that a couple of those have got general plan updates approved. So we're hopeful that HCD will consider that and allow us to do that.
Okay.
But it is going to be a discussion.
And if they don't, then we can go to SCAG, because they're saying they'll help cities with their general plan updates. So, okay.
The question would be, how we use the 310,000. It's a use it or lose it. If we don't use it, it'll go somewhere else.
Okay. I think those were all my questions. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Nelson, for this. Just to be clear, cities don't build housing, so this is just our plans, right? We're just putting zoning in there. Yes, I'm just making sure. So
Year one is for planning.
Okay,
Future years will be for implementation, so we could provide direct assistance.
we're not going to be in the rental business.
No, I would
Thank you.
never
I'm just
suggest
making
the
sure.
city should be in the rental business.
Just making sure that that's clear. And then as far as our plan review process, I mean, we definitely need to make changes to that, so this is good to see. I don't want to see government getting into, too much control as far as, I mean, obviously builders are the professional builders and designers, right? So you guys take all that into consideration when you're making these automatic plan check lists.
Well, the hope is that we would be able to identify a partner in this project area, and we could work collaboratively with that partner to identify standards that would be applicable to the actual project that they want to build, that would also be consistent with the community's desires.
Okay. And then I also want to echo what Linda said about our housing for the elderly. That's a big need right now in our valley, and like you said, smaller, different type of
Well, everything,
apartments, but
the mobility hub, the downtown specific plan, all talk about senior workforce housing. So certainly senior housing we would see as being an important component of this, but that may require a little different development standards than we currently have.
all right. Thank you. Russ, do you want to think?
Yes. Nelson, thank you very much for that walkthrough. It was very enlightening and thorough. So I appreciate that. Just a couple questions. I like my colleagues. I like the idea of the checklist approach and simplifying, because one of the things that cities often get accused of, and we've heard it here, is that it takes too long to get a project through. So streamlining it in any way that we can makes very good sense for a lot of practical reasons. One of the thoughts or questions that I have, as you prepare those requirements, would you envision that there'll be appendixes to those that call out very specific, for example, the topic of walkways? Would you have an appendix that says the following list of walkway surface materials are approved?
Yes.
And then you would also have a list of those that would not be acceptable?
Yes. Those are the types of very specific objective standards that we would foresee being a part of this. And, you identify the checklist approach. I mean, one thing that's implicit in this that not everybody may realize is to go through this process means there's no environmental review, because it's an administrative process. And, we've already studied, especially the downtown project, to death. There's been studies and studies and studies on that. So this would allow development to go forward without additional environmental studies.
The other question that occurred to me, and although you'd like to think that it wouldn't happen, relates to the electronic plan review. I certainly support enhanced ability to do things remotely without having to bring necessarily hard copy plans and schedule appointments and stand in line. So that makes good sense from an efficiency standpoint. Where it's in place, has there been any experience where there's some potential for abuse? And by that I mean, I could see an electronic plan being submitted and an electronic approval being returned back, and then once they get it back, that electronic version is very pliable. And is there a system of checks and balances to make sure that what actually was approved at the city level is what actually materializes during.
Sure. I mean, there's definitely ways of doing that. I mean, that's no different than what we do now with hard copy plans. You know, there's a stamped copy of the plans that go back to the developer that's to be retained on the site. But, you know, theoretically, somebody could manipulate that too. But there's checks and balances for that the same way in electronic plans. There's checks and balances to make sure that we're working on the correct set of plans that are approved, that are held by the city as the approved set of plans.
Okay.
I mean, the county has used a system similar to this for 5 years now. So it is working. It is also working in other cities. But I happen to be familiar with the county because our firm has worked with them closely for the last 10 years.
Thank you.
Do either of the commissioners have any comments or questions?
You want to come to the microphone if you have some.
You have to go to the microphone, John.
Thank you, Russ. I'm sorry. Thank you, Nelson. I guess my only comment at this point is in regards to streamlining reviews. I think that's something that the development community is definitely welcoming. I would recommend, like you mentioned, working with the other agencies that are interdependent with us in terms of what technologies that they're using, processes that they're using, whether it be, I noticed you identified DocX, thank you. I think the county is Bluebeam, and so there's some different technologies, but the more that we can overlap and make those things consistent, the better that it will be. And then one other thing is with the historic downtown, if there's a way to kind of incorporate standards for that particular corridor, the downtown Hemet or downtown Florida Avenue. I think that would be a great opportunity to use some of this funding for that. So, thank you.
I think there's an incredible opportunity here. And I think it's about time that we move forward on something, and this gives us the opportunity to do so at no cost to us. So the county, for what the county, the funding that the county had put aside for the mobility hub, from conveying that, huh? RTA. Or, excuse me, RTA. What, was there a particular, I'm sure there's a sunset on that. And we're probably like half there. So, Larry, can you give us an idea of what that limitation is?
Thank you, Mayor and Council. We have $6.9 million budgeted for the project. There's 61,581 that's at risk. It's
Would you repeat that number again?
61,581 at risk. As long as the project's moving forward, I'm sure we can preserve that money.
Okay.
But as Nelson pointed out, there are other issues that we have to deal with. The retail component of the mobility hub was going to pay for security and O&M. And as Council Member Krupa pointed out, the outreach with the public was extensive, and the expectation level, was set for retail and the mobility hub. It's not to say we can't change the scope of the project. It's the City Council at your pleasure. But I think the market assessment that you talked about doing is essential before I would take this back to the RTA board, and I'd want to ensure that the council is supportive of that before we go to the RTA board to present it to them for their consideration.
Thank you. I certainly
mention, if I may, Mayor, that the concept here was to do a joint RFP with RTA to go out and select a developer. And so certainly the ideas that we're presenting here aren't absolutely cast in stone. If we can find a developer that believes there's a retail opportunity, we certainly want to take advantage of that because, of course, the city is always interested in sales tax. The key is to find that, and this is a joint effort between the two agencies that we would collectively look at that and select a developer together. So we certainly want to work very closely with RTA to make sure that their needs are met as well as what the city sees as opportunities.
Right. So I certainly encourage electronic plan review, mainly for the shortening of that, of what normally takes us time to do, as long as it's still as effective, and to a standard that we can all live with, which I'm assuming that it would be. I'm really interested in the fact in having the senior housing element, much like the Sahara apartment project that has been very successful and certainly aesthetically pleasing and in need, community in need. So, and the fact that if there's transit close by for these seniors to have access to, that's certainly an asset. As far as the retail goes, I'm sure there's a lot of people in this community that would love to see some retail in this town, and it just has to be the right retail. I mean, we can't just throw something in there, obviously, just to fill a space, but it's time and time again that the community wants to stay and shop here. They don't want to have to go to Temecula or Murrieta or up to Banning. So if we're real strategic about it, I see no reason why it can't be a very positive for this project. Can we utilize, and I don't know why I don't know this, but you talk about Devonshire not really being a good commercial area, but I think Oakland is. Oakland could be. So in any event, bottom line is, if council doesn't have any more questions or comments, I'm going to go to the public to see if any members of the public would like to comment on this item. Do you have anybody wanting to speak?
Yes, Mayor Wright, I have one request to speak form, and it's Mitch Slagerman.
Okay, Mr. Slagerman, come up to the podium, please.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and members of the council. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Mitch Slagerman. I am Vice President for Development for Palm Communities, which is a developer of affordable housing here in California. It's a 40-year-old company with about 2,000 units throughout California, including 143 right here in the city of Hemet. It's called Hemet Vistas. It's located at State Street in Fruitvale. And thank you. We like working in communities where we've had a good experience and where we're liked. We believe we've had that good experience here in Hemet and would like to continue to invest here if given the right opportunity. We just recently did $4 million of rehabilitation at Hemet Vistas, improving the outside as well as all the units on the inside. So we've been here for about 18 or 19 years, and so we continue to invest in your community. And I think that's what good developers should do. And I think there's a real opportunity here, and so I'm speaking in favor of good planning here for the city of Hemet. Many sources throughout California have said that there's a great need for housing in California for folks in all income ranges. We happen to focus on families who are in the lower income ranges because they have a need, and we do provide them with rental units that are below market so that they can pull themselves out of their straits and hopefully gain home ownership if that's their desire. We believe in really good planning. From a development point of view, it's very important because it defines goals and standards. But most importantly, it creates certainty. That's the most important thing for us in development is certainty. Certainty in the timing that it would take to achieve an approval, and the certainty that you have standards that are going to be maintained, and that if we know that's going to be the way it is, then we can plan from our side around it. And we really encourage these planning goals because, or goals that actually can be financed and constructed. So it's wonderful to have wonderful goals, and if you like gold, yellow brick gold sidewalks, so that's wonderful, but it's not always practical from a financing point of view. So we're very reliant on a number of sources for us to be able to finance our projects. And these sources come from the state of California, the same folks that are offering you this grant, HCD, as well as the tax credit allocation committee, where most of our funding comes from. In fact, that's how we funded the Hemet Vistas, with some great help from the county of Riverside, who are still partners in that project. So in conclusion, we believe that good decisions coupled with good planning design, coupled with very strong property management, will provide and create high-quality housing for residents at all income levels. And we really believe in strong property management so that we can maintain our investment and the investment in your community for a long period of time. We believe we've accomplished that. So I encourage you to plan if you can.
Thank you for coming out tonight.
Sure.
And I'd like to thank our partners in this endeavor for being here tonight. And so with that, we need a recommendation or direction to apply for the grant application or to.
I will also mention too, prioritizing the projects as it stands now. Is the plan to go after all the items that are listed there, Nelson?
Yes, the projects we proposed total to $310,000 that is available. The first 4 projects meet project priority areas, so we believe those will be approved without question. The 5th project, we may have to have some discussion with them, but we would suggest all 5 projects move forward. And directions to the City Council, we would bring back the actual application to you as soon as we can, and it does require a resolution of the City Council authorizing that application.
So with that, may I have a motion?
All right, I move that we move forward on this SB2 planning grant with the 5 projects that were going over by Nelson that we discussed.
Okay, please vote. And that's approved 4-0. Thank you so much. Thanks for everybody's time. And I look forward to seeing that resolution come through and moving ahead. Since we've been here since 5 o'clock already, and we're going to take a 5-minute recess and be back here, but close, a little bit after 7. Thank you.